Hello everyone. This is in essence a general overview of the central nervous system. It does delve a little more deeply into the CNS than you might be expecting, but a lot of this I believe is going to be very important for you either in lab or lecture. If you want to look at things that are pertaining only to things that you have to know in lab, you're going to want to look at the quiz video regarding testing your knowledge of the central nervous system. This particular video is going to show some other videos that are basically looking at the development of the brain and what happens when you have certain lesions in parts of the brain that are caused by severing of certain parts or maybe even a stroke. So beginning with the divisions of the brain, during really early prenatal development, your brain is only in 3 divisions, and that is the prosencephalon or the forebrain, the mesencephalon or the midbrain, and the rhombencephalon or the hindbrain. And over development, as your brain begins to partition itself, you then get the telencephalon and the diencephalon, which are parts of the forebrain. You get the metencephalon and the myelencephalon, which are divisions of the rhombencephalon, and then of course there's also the spinal cord. Alright, so beginning with the telencephalon, which is a division of the forebrain, the telencephalon is the largest portion of your brain. It contains the cerebral cortex. It contains, of course, then the cerebral hemispheres. It also contains your amygdala, which is involved in emotions such as when you form an attachment with a blanket. It involves the hippocampus, which is involved in consolidation of memory. It also contains the basal ganglia that are involved in movement. We're going to look quickly at the cortical regions. These are what you're all familiar with. The cortical regions are your frontal lobe, your parietal lobe, your temporal lobe, and your occipital lobe. Now, the frontal lobe contains your primary motor cortex. Your parietal lobe contains your somatosensory cortex. The temporal lobe contains your primary auditory cortex, and the occipital lobe contains your primary visual cortex. Now, the telencephalon also involves or contains your cerebral hemispheres, which, interestingly, are not bilateral. So your right hemisphere and your left hemisphere differ in functionality. For instance, your left hemisphere is under right-hand control. If you are a right-handed person, you use your left hemisphere more, right? The left hemisphere is your speech center. It is your writing center. It also houses your right ear auditory cortex. It's also the language and mathematical calculation center, and is innervated by your right visual field. This is often considered the linear thinking hemisphere because it's involved in lists and language and logic. Your right hemisphere, on the other hand, is under left hand control. So if you're left-handed, you more often use your right hemisphere. It's involved in touch sensation. There's the left ear auditory cortex. It's involved in spatial visualization and is innervated by the left visual field. It's also involved in emotional expression and music and creativity and imagination. It's often called the holistic thinking hemisphere. And so left-handed people tend to be really creative. They are very artistic. My left-handed friends are amazing artists, which is insane. So that is how your brain is organized. And your hemispheres are connected by what is called the corpus callosum. Now, interestingly, the corpus callosum can be absent at birth, or it can be severed in certain accidents, and this can result in what's called a split brain. So once again, a split brain is when the corpus callosum has been severed or it's absent. Now this is a video showing you a man who has a split brain as a result of an accident, and you're going to see how his thought processing differs from somebody's who has an intact corpus callosum.
Information from each side of the body goes to the opposite side of the brain, and many functions are performed half on one side, half on the other. But certain tasks are committed much more to one hemisphere, especially in human beings. The right hemisphere is specialized for spatial judgments, while the left can describe its perceptions in words. Normally, these two specialized halves work together as one.
I know the left hemisphere and right hemisphere now are working independent of each other, but you don't notice it. Now, you just kind of adapt to it. It doesn't, you don't have any feeling, it doesn't feel any different than it did before.
The corpus callosum, a huge bundle of fibers, connects the two halves of the brain. When it's damaged, in Joe's case through surgery to relieve epilepsy, then it almost seems that there are two separate people sharing a single head.
What we can do is play tricks by putting information into his disconnected, mute, non-talking right hemisphere and watch it produce behaviors. And out of that, we can really see that there is, in fact, a reason to believe that there's all kinds of complex processes going on outside of his conscious awareness of his left half brain. Joe, I'm going to show you some things. I just want you to tell me what you see. And here we go. You ready? Look right at the dot.
Okay.
Right. Okay, you ready? Look right at the dot.
Grapes.
Good. When Joe focuses on a point, everything to the right of the point goes to his left brain, the dominant hemisphere for language and speech. So we can see here that when we flash a word or a picture, Joe is easily able to name it.
See it.
Close your eyes and let your left hand do a little work here. Okay, what do you got there?
Hand.
Okay, very good. Now, when a word or a picture falls to the left of a fixation point, that information goes to his disconnected right half brain. And as we can see here, Joe is unable to name it. Joe is able to draw the picture with his left hand, the left hand getting its major control from the right half brain. What did you draw?
Okay.
What did you see?
Wheel on one side. I don't know what it's on yet.
So even though he can't name it, his left hand is able to draw out the picture of the stimulus of the picture or word that we presented to his right half brain. What did you see?
Hammer.
So just close your eyes and draw with your left hand. Just let it go. Nice, what's that?
Saw.
Yeah. What'd you see?
Hammer.
What'd you draw that for?
I don't know.
What Joe and patients like him, and there are many of them, teaches us is that the mind is made up of a constellation of independent, semi-independent agents, and that these agents, these processes can carry on a vast number of activities outside of our conscious awareness. Even though that goes on, there's some final stage or some final system, which I happen to think is in the left hemisphere, that pulls all of this information together into a theory. It has to generate a theory to explain all of these independent elements. And so, and that theory becomes our particular theory of ourself and of the world.
From impulses leaving the eyes to a theory of ourself and the world, we're beginning to learn how the cerebral cortex gives us our understanding. Francis Crick, famous for his contributions to molecular biology, is now fascinated with perception and with the relationship between brain.
All right, so that was a really amazing example of a split brain. And so I hope you guys watched that video and you paid close attention. to what happens when the corpus callosum gets severed by any traumatic accident. We're going to be actually going through a few more videos of other sorts of issues that can occur with portions of the brain and what happens when they get severed or lesioned or something happens such as a stroke. Alright, so I hope you found that video of the split brain as interesting as I did. I find anything that's involved in neuroscience pretty interesting. But moving back onto the cerebrum, right? Your cerebrum is made of your cortical lobes, such as your frontal lobe and your parietal and your temporal and your occipital, which are all different association areas of your cortex. Your frontal lobe, for instance, contains your precentral gyrus. This is your primary motor cortex. Your parietal lobe contains the postcentral gyrus, which is your somatosensory cortex. Your precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus are divided by what's called a central sulcus. Within your temporal lobe is the superior temporal gyrus. This is your primary auditory cortex. And the occipital lobe is the location of your primary visual cortex. Also in the cerebrum, you're going to find, for instance, fissures, such as your lateral fissure. Now, there are several parts to your cerebrum. The cerebral cortex is considered to be the very outer layer of your cerebrum, made of gray matter or unmyelinated axons. The inner layer of your cerebrum is white matter or myelinated axons, but also within the cerebrum are what's called the basal nuclei, and these are clusters of gray matter that are embedded in white matter, such as your caudate nucleus, your putamen, and your globus pallidus. So now we're going to get a little more in depth regarding all the sensory areas of your cortical regions, for instance. So your sensory areas are your primary somatosensory cortex. Once again, this is located at your postcentral gyrus. This involves sensory receptors that are being relayed from your skin and skeletal muscles, joints, and the tendons. This also involves auditory areas located in your temporal lobe that are receiving information from your inner ear. The gustatory cortex is located in the insula within the temporal lobe, and it's this gustatory cortex that's receiving information from your taste buds. The visual area is also a sensory area. This is located in the occipital lobe, and this is of course receiving information from the retina of your eye. So in your cerebrum are also motor areas. This includes your primary motor cortex, which is once again located in the precentral gyrus of your frontal lobe. It is this primary motor cortex that controls the voluntary movement of your skeletal muscles. There's also the frontal eye field that controls voluntary movement of the eyes. The premotor cortex lies anterior to the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe, and this is involved in planning movements. Now there are also some specialized association areas like Broca's area, for instance, which is located at the base of the precentral gyrus in your left hemisphere only. It's Broca's area that controls muscles that are involved in speech. The prefrontal cortex is the most anterior portion of the frontal lobe involved in decision making and personality, any higher thought processing that you may have. Wernickes area is located at the junction between the parietal and temporal lobe, only in the left hemisphere, and it's Wernickes area that has a role in sounding out familiar words. Now, just to get you more familiar with Broca's area and Wernickes area, these are very important locations in your left hemisphere for speech and making a meaningful conversation with other people. And if something happens to these areas due to instances such as a stroke, it can be really hard for a person to have a meaningful conversation. And so when this happens, it's called, for instance, Brocas aphasia, if it's referring to Broca's area. You guys should know by now that Broca's area is important for putting words together to form complete sentences. So this video is going to show you somebody who has Brocas aphasia. And I can't remember if this was due to a stroke or not, but you'll be able to see what happens when this person is unable to put words together.
Can you tell us your name?
Mike Caputo.
And Mike, when was your stroke?
I was 7 years ago.
Okay.
And
what did you used to do?
Worked Autodesk, sales and worldwide, and very good, yeah.
Okay, and who are you looking at over there when you turn your head?
That's my wife.
Okay, and why is she helping you to talk?
She's a speech.
So you have trouble with your speech?
Yeah.
And what's that called?
Aphasia.
All right. And so why don't you work now?
I do.
And what do you do now?
Voices of Hope aphasia.
And what is Voices of Hope?
Petersburg, and Dr. Hinckley and myself, founder for me, and members members probably 60 people.
So 60 people are part of Voices of Hope,
Yes.
which is an aphasia support group
Yes.
that you founded.
Yes.
And Dr. Jackie Hinckley is part of that.
Yes.
Okay, great.
It's not a support group.
No.
It's
programs. It's 3 days. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and and they laugh and talked, music here, just beautiful. It's,
Great.
yeah.
Can you tell me, what does it feel like to have aphasia?
It's hard. It's it's speech. It's like words that don't understand. Brain is good, but it's speech like I don't know. It's like words, yuck.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, so as you guys could see there, he had a lot of trouble making complete sentences. As he said, brain is all there. He's understanding what she was asking of him, but words, yuck. Now, Wernickes aphasia is a little different. It can also occur due to stroke, and this is where the person has a little more difficulty interpreting particular meanings of the spoken words, and so It's more than just being unable to put complete sentences together. The sentences don't make any sense whatsoever. So we're going to watch this video with someone who has Wernickes Aphasia.
Hi Byron, how are you?
I'm happy. Are you pretty? You look good.
What are you doing today?
We stayed with the water over here at the moment and talk with the people, with them over there. They're diving for them at the moment. They'll save in the moment. He'll have water very soon for him. With luck for him.
So we're on a cruise and we're about to
We
get to
will
June.
store it right here and they'll save their hands right there for them.
And what were we just doing with the iPad?
Right at the moment, they don't show a darn thing.
With the iPad that we were doing. Like here?
I'd like my change for me and change hands for me. It would happen. I would talk with Donna sometimes. We're out with them. Other people are working with them. I'm very happy with them.
Good.
This girl was very good and happy. And I play golf and hit other trees. We play out with the hands. We save a lot of hands on hold for people, for us, other hands. I don't know what you get, but I talk with a lot of hand for him. Sometime. Am I talk of any more to saying?
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I hope the world lasts for you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
All right, so first off, he is absolutely adorable, but you probably had a tough time trying to interpret what he was saying. He certainly was not able to interpret what she was asking and then respond to her questions in a meaningful way. So that's Wernickes Aphasia. All right, so that's your telencephalon of your forebrain. Now we're moving into the diencephalon of your forebrain. And this contains your hypothalamus, your thalamus, your epithalamus, and all of these are basically surrounding what's called the third ventricle. So your hypothalamus is regulating your physiological events. Inferior to your hypothalamus is the pituitary gland, both of which are involved in endocrine function. The thalamus, once again, functions as a relay station for all sensory inputs, interestingly except smell. So your olfactory sensation pathway is a little funky compared to the rest of your sensory inputs, but almost all of your sensory inputs get relayed from the thalamus to the associated areas of the cortex, such as the primary motor cortex. The epithalamus contains your choroid plexus, and this is where cerebrospinal fluid is produced. This is also where you'll find your pineal gland, which releases melatonin, so it's involved in your, circadian rhythm. The midbrain is also called your mesencephalon. Now you don't really have to know all this. This is just sort of extra information just to sort of put things together. But your midbrain is at the very tip of your brainstem, the very top superior part of it. This is where the tectum or the corpora quadrigemina is located. The corpora is basically just this grouping of your inferior colliculi and superior colliculi. The inferior colliculi is the auditory pathway, and the superior colliculi is the visual pathway. And so obviously these colliculi are going to innervate either your temporal or occipital lobe. The tegmentum is also called the cerebral peduncle. This is where the periaqueductal gray matter is located, involved in pain sensation. The red nucleus is involved in movement or gait. And the substantia nigra has a function in rewarding. And then also you'll find your fourth ventricle here in the midbrain. The last subdivision of your brain is the rhombencephalon or your hindbrain. This is further subdivided into the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. The metencephalon contains your pons, which is involved in alertness, sleep, respiration, swallowing, bladder control, hearing, taste, and eye movement. It's also involved in the, contains the cerebellum that's involved in coordinating muscular activity. The myelencephalon has the medulla oblongata, which is involved in a lot of autonomic or involuntary functions, such as breathing and vomiting and sneezing and heart rate and blood pressure. Now, your brainstem contains your midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And so the brainstem is sometimes called your lizard brain because it is kind of just involved in mindless things. So you don't generally think about it when you're breathing, for instance, or when you're blinking, or when you are moving sometimes. So just an interesting tidbit, The Walking Dead, when the people die, right, their cortex shuts off, but the brainstem comes back on. And so that's why the only thing zombies are interested in is just mindless thumping around and mindless eating, basically, and mindless breathing. Now, the one thing I realized in making this particular PowerPoint video is that there was no model that accurately depicted all three of the meninges for your brain. The one that I thought did, turns out it only showed one of the meninges, which was kind of weird. So we're going to have to work on a better way for you guys to be able to see the meninges. But your three meninges are the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. Sometimes the subarachnoid layer is considered part of the meninges, depending on which book or manual you're reading. The dura mater is the outer meninge. This contains what's known as the dural sinus, which is the vascular structure that collects the blood and directs that blood, which is deoxygenated, towards the internal jugular vein. And right, those jugular veins converge to become the superior vena cava that takes that blood to the heart. The arachnoid matter is loose brain covering. It's just below the dura mater. It also has the subarachnoid layer that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And then the closest to your brain is the pia mater, composed of vascular connective tissue that is clinging very tightly to the brain surface. Now, there are three major partitions of the dura mater, and that's the falx cerebri, falx cerebelli, and tentorium cerebelli. We're not going to go over them in depth, but you probably do need to be able to identify them on a picture because they are on your need-to-know list. There are also the ventricles, which are just networks of cavities that contain cerebrospinal fluid. There are two lateral ventricles, and then there's the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. Remember, the third ventricle is kind of contained in your diencephalon, and the fourth ventricle you can find in your midbrain. And then, of course, last but not least, there is the spinal cord with its own set of spinal meninges, its own set of white and gray matter, and spinal nerves. The meninges are in the same order. The dura mater is the outermost layer, followed by the arachnoid matter, and then the pia mater. The gray matter forms that sort of butterfly in the center of the spinal cord, surrounded by white matter. And if you remember, it is gray matter that is unmyelinated and white matter is myelinated. And then there are the spinal nerves. There is the posterior dorsal root nerve and the anterior ventral root nerve. The ventral and the dorsal roots actually fuse, right? Once again, the gray matter is the ventral and dorsal horns of that butterfly. The ventral root is basically the afferent motor neurons. The ganglion is where the cell bodies are located. The dorsal root is a sensory neuron, and you'll notice that that is a unipolar neuron. you'll notice that the ventral root, because it is a motor neuron, and all motor neurons are multipolar, that the ventral root is made of a multipolar neuron. The dorsal root is made of a unipolar neuron. The dorsal root is involved in sensory neuron or efferent functions. And again, the ganglion is located where the cell body is located.